On this episode of The Rise the Limit, we explore Chapter 9, Gilded Glory, Granite Graves. We find a city where the legacy of maritime riches embodied in stunning architecture met the earth-shattering force of 1755, an event that reshaped not just stone, but European ideas. Follow our journey as these histories collide. Damage, delays, discoveries. A day down Lisbon lanes. So, what precisely triggers a meltdown in a child abroad? If you guessed international diplomacy or a sudden philosophical crisis, you'd be wrong. My son, fresh from some prior, now forgotten mild inconvenience, was erupting like a small, hangry volcano. His target, Lisbon's hamburgers. Apparently, serving something locally advertised as American style that failed to replicate the exact grease bomb available back home constituted high treason against cow, condiment, and country. He wasn't entirely wrong. The Portuguese interpretation seemed less a burger and more a polite suggestion involving meat and bread, possibly conceived by someone listening to mournful fado music. I attempted a lesson in global food relations. "Look at Mexican food," I offered reasonably. We grabbed it, deep-fried its soul, slapped it between two cardboard shells, added a drive-through window, and called it Taco Bell. It's ours now. This profound wisdom did little to soothe him. Burger crisis averted. Of course. Sort of. We ventured into a city still blinking after the previous night's storm. Lisbon looked like Mother Nature had thrown a particularly violent tantrum, littering the streets with tree limbs and torn billboards as if decorating for a catastrophe-themed block party. She'd certainly made her point, leaving the locals to sweep up the mess. Our brilliant plan for a quick crosstown drive immediately dissolved into a 40-minute ordeal, a glacial tour conducted at the mercy of Lisbon's notorious traffic, where forward movement feels largely theoretical. The hotel, when we finally oozed up to it, offered a surprise. A massive mural climbed its face, floor by floor, a story unfolding vertically like some sort of architectural comic book. Different, I had to admit. Our itinerary demanded culture. First up, the Tower of Belém. Was it merely a fancy toll booth from the 1500s? Pretty much. It sat there neatly by the water, a highly decorated chunk of limestone looking like a wedding cake baked by a paranoid monarch. Officially, it guarded the harbour entrance and served as a grand embarkation point for explorers setting off to accidentally discover places. Unofficially, it was perfectly placed for shaking down merchants for customs fees, a respectable government racket back in the day. Its fancy stonework, dripping with sculpted ropes, sea creatures and armillary spheres, a kind of old-timey GPS made of stone, basically screamed, "We're rich from spices, deal with it." They call it Manueline style. I called it conspicuously expensive. For all its defensive posturing, it looked less imposing and more smug. Nearby, its sterner cousin, some massive military monument, stood flexing its stone muscles, subtly suggesting that complaining about the parking situation might be hazardous to your health. Deciding discretion was the better part of valor, and also we were hungry, we ambled onward and ducked into an aggressively modern art building. Why? Because it advertised lunch. Eating soup surrounded by large canvases smeared with aggressive splashes of paint felt dangerously cultured. A nagging suspicion persisted. Was my minestrone bowl part of a particularly convincing installation? This contrast, ancient defences right next door to minimalist canteens, seemed quintessentially Lisbon. The city seemed determined to hand you a history lesson and a modern art critique simultaneously, often while you were just trying to find a decent sandwich. A meal in an art gallery. Very cultured, very European. Lisbon's lavish landmark, legacies of long voyages. Still processing Lisbon's take on the all-American hamburger, not to mention the city's general air of having recently lost a wrestling match with the weather, we found ourselves confronting a new indignity: the queue. This particular line snaked before the Jerónimos Monastery, a 30-minute study in the magnetic pull of very old stones. Standing there, simmering gently in the Portuguese sun, felt a bit rich. Mere moments ago, we'd been critiquing the questionable authenticity of lunch. Now we were patiently waiting to gawk at a monument bankrolled by questionable adventures in spice acquisition. It struck me as the sort of cultural exchange my son, the burger purist, might also find grounds to protest. To distract myself, I became fascinated by the tiny reptiles darting across the warm walls. Iberian wall lizards, according to a quick phone consultation later. They looked like miniature dinosaurs, utterly unimpressed by the shuffling humans, probably the true landlords of Lisbon just watching another wave of invaders sigh and check their watches. These walls, the lizard's current domain, belonged to the monastery of St. Jerome, or Mosteiro dos Jerónimos, if you're collecting local pronunciations. It's a massive chunk of religious real estate parked near the Tagus River. Back around 1501, King Manuel I figured Portugal's booming spice trade, largely financed by skimming 5% off the top of pepper, cloves and cinnamon pilfered from the east, deserved a suitably flashy stone advertisement. He ordered this place built right where Vasco da Gama and his crew supposedly had a pre-game prayer before sailing off to India. No pressure, Vasco. This historical footnote probably explains the building's hyperactive architectural style, known as Manueline. It's basically Gothic architecture that someone attacked with a shipload of maritime symbols: ropes, shells, anchors, sea monsters. Like a naval recruitment poster carved in limestone by a very caffeinated sculptor with a possible obsession with barnacles. Someone important slapped a UNESCO World Heritage label on it, which mainly translates to longer lines. The sheer volume of carving is something else, especially around the south portal. It seemed less like a doorway and more like a final, possibly impossible exam for apprentice stonemasons. Somewhere in the stony crowd was Henry the Navigator, looking appropriately windswept and important. It occurred to me that funding this extravaganza, which took a century to finish by taxing the very discoveries it celebrated, might have raised an eyebrow or two, but history suggests otherwise. I mostly just wished the line would move faster than the geological formation of the surrounding hills. Eventually we shuffled inside. The promised intricate Gothic architecture was indeed there, all soaring columns and high-arched windows throwing sunlight onto the floor like spilled paint. After the muffled roar of the queue, the immense space felt uncannily quiet, the limestone swallowing sound whole. The famous cloister, a square courtyard framed by delicate stone lace, continued the nautical theme, ropes and globes worked into the arches, a constant, stony reminder of the ships and spices that paid the bills. It was undeniably impressive, a grand statement built with equal parts devotion and profit margin. Somewhere in this quiet vastness, tucked away in his own fancy box, lay Vasco da Gama himself, the great explorer done exploring. In the echoing silence, the click of my own shoes on the worn stone floor sounded impossibly loud. Vasco da Gama, the explorer who opened the sea route to India. Those arched windows, the ones stretching up towards heaven inside the Jerónimos Monastery, were something else. So were the stone curlicues dripping everywhere. Clear proof. Someone had spent an eye-watering amount of money earned from cinnamon sticks and peppercorns. Turns out, all this impressive stone wasn't just for show, nor solely for housing those little lizard rulers I'd seen skittering outside. It was also, rather fittingly, the final parking spot for Vasco da Gama himself. Seemed appropriate, burying the guy famous for sailing halfway across the planet in a building funded by the profits from exactly those kinds of long-haul adventures, a permanent dry dock carved from limestone instead of dug from mud. Now, Vasco da Gama. You hear the name and picture a fearless explorer, maybe with a parrot, definitely with a beard that smelled faintly of salt and questionable decisions. The man who found India mostly by pointing his ship vaguely east and hoping for the best, right? Well, sort of. He did skipper the first European ships around Africa to India back in the late 1490s. Portugal, you see, desperately craved direct access to spices, keen to cut out the middlemen who'd been marking up the nutmeg something fierce. He sailed from Lisbon, managed the tricky turn around the Cape of Good Hope, just like Bartolomeo Dias before him, and eventually washed up in Calicut, India. A big deal, first European to arrive by sea. His skills as a gift-giver, however, could have used a workshop. Apparently the local bigwig, the Zamorin of Calicut, wasn't floored by the treasures Vasco presented. Imagine sailing for months, surviving storms and the peculiar misery of scurvy only to have your welcoming present greeted with the enthusiasm usually reserved for jury duty summons. You could almost hear a synchronized Portuguese sigh echo down through the centuries. His attempt at diplomacy kind of bombed. What treasures did he haul across the ocean to impress a potentate sitting at the crossroads of world trade? 12 woolen cloaks, perfect for Calicut's notoriously nippy tropical climate. 6 hats, the kind you wouldn't look twice at in Lisbon, let alone in a land dripping with silks and jewels. A case of coral beads, which apparently ranked just above seashells on the local blingometer. Plus, just to round it out, some sugar, oil, and honey, because nothing says exotic foreign power like pantry staples you could already get down the street. The Zamorin, perhaps stifling a yawn, politely declined any serious trade agreement. Better gifts were required, he suggested, possibly hinting at things that didn't involve sweating profusely or accessorizing like a forgotten peasant. Da Gama sailed away, empty-handed but presumably wiser. When he returned in 1502, he left the woolen cloaks at home. He brought warships instead. That approach, as noted before, seemed to do the trick much more effectively than bargain basement haberdashery. One approach gets you laughed out of court. The other approach gets you the spice trade, a distinctly 1500s version of art of the deal, perhaps. That approach, unsurprisingly, proved a bit more convincing for establishing trade relations. It's one way to do business, I suppose. A rather direct way, involving significantly more gunpowder than pleasantries, but a way nonetheless. It certainly makes you think about what discovery and diplomacy really meant back then. Some might ask if showing up with cannons qualifies as a friendly introduction. And here he lies now, Vasco da Gama, surrounded by carved stone and echoing quiet, forever anchored after a lifetime spent chasing horizons, possibly still dreaming of better welcome gifts. Bloody banners, da Gama's dominance decreed. So, about those famously terrible welcoming gifts Vasco da Gama tried palming off on the Zamorin of Calicut back in '98. The woolly cloaks fit for a drafty Lisbon winter, the hats nobody'd wear, even on a dare, the beads about as valuable as pocket lint. Predictably, they went over like a lead balloon. Diplomacy, it seems, wasn't exactly Vasco's hidden talent. Navigating was clearly more his speed. He slunk away from Calicut, probably feeling less like a bold explorer and more like a dismissed door-to-door salesman, the sound of snickering merchants echoing across the water. But he learned something vital about Indian trade customs, all right. Fast forward to 1502. The scene, the Indian Ocean, somewhere off the coast of modern-day Kerala. A ship carrying Muslim pilgrims, loaded with families, is drifting peacefully. Enter Vasco da Gama, stage left, now less wide-eyed navigator, more seasoned maritime enforcer. He gives the nod, his men swarm the vessel, grab anything shiny, shove the passengers below deck, and then, just to really make a point, set the whole thing on fire. It's a historical footnote often conveniently misplaced when printing those heroic explorer narratives for school kids, but it tells you pretty much everything about where Portugal's age of discovery was heading. Think less cheerful discovery, more Scarface takes up sailing. When da Gama first sailed in 1497, he was breaking new ground, albeit sometimes by accidentally bumping into it. By 1502, he was less explorer, more human bulldozer. His first trip proved the sea route around Africa to India worked and could make money, even if it was seasoned with awkward encounters, hostage situations, and gift exchanges that bombed spectacularly. But by the time he geared up for trip number 2, Portugal's game plan had shifted. King Manuel I's instructions were simple. Brutally so. Get back to India, lock down the spice trade, elbow the Arab merchants out of the picture entirely, and if anyone argued, introduce them to the persuasive power of cannonballs. Diplomacy was officially off the table, replaced by gunpowder diplomacy. So Gama sailed from Lisbon again, this time with 20 ships, 800 men, and the kind of swagger you only see on someone who's never had to personally haggle over the price of pepper. What he lacked in charm, he more than made up for with artillery. His approach in India became a simple formula. Issue demands to local rulers like they were slow employees, insist on exclusive trading rights, and blast any port city that didn't immediately say, "Yes, sir." Back in Calicut, the Zamorin, who'd once hosted the Portuguese, albeit unimpressed guests, was now treated like an unruly subordinate. When the Zamorin refused Gama's terms, Vasco, ever the people person, grabbed a nearby boatload of Indian traders, ordered their ears, noses, and hands chopped off, and sent the grisly package back to shore, with a note, presumably saying something like, "Hope to do business with you soon." He was, to put it mildly, negotiating with extreme prejudice. Of course, this sort of behavior usually comes wrapped in a justification, and Gama's was the all-purpose banner of Christian duty. He declared the Indian Ocean was overrun with infidels messing up the spice business, and he was just doing a bit of holy pest control. Conveniently, a pope back in Europe had already given a PayPal nod to Spain and Portugal, carving up the non-European world between them. Turns out, a blessing from the Vatican pairs nicely with naval bombardment. Even back then, though, Gama's methods raised eyebrows. Not just among the Indians, Arabs, and East Africans finding their ships suddenly blockaded or sunk, but even some folks back in Portugal started muttering that perhaps old Vasco had traded his compass for cruelty. Still, you couldn't argue with results. His burn and conquer strategy worked. Portuguese ships became a permanent and widely feared fixture in the Indian Ocean. They started issuing mandatory cartaz passes to merchant ships, basically protection money, strong-arming coastal cities and building forts. Gama hadn't just opened a door to India, he'd kicked it down, set fire to the frame, and planted a flag in the ashes. He sailed back to Portugal a hero, proving that age-old historical truth. It doesn't matter so much how you get the gold and nutmeg, just that you bring it home. His reward eventually came in the form of the grand title Viceroy of India. Curiously, they waited 2 decades to give it to him, perhaps letting the smoke clear from the 1502 public relations nightmare. And all that spice wealth extracted under duress flowed right back to Lisbon. It paid for stunning buildings like this Jerónimos Monastery I'm standing in right now, staring at Vasco's elaborate tomb. Quite the setup. A magnificent house of God funded by intimidating people thousands of miles away. They even named the longest bridge in Europe after him, just down the road here in Lisbon. I guess Vasco da Gama Bridge paid for by scaring people with cannons until they handed over their spices was a bit too wordy for the sign makers. Down in India, places he visited like Kochi and Goa might have different sorts of memorials, possibly with a slightly less celebratory tone. Portugal finally gave him the big promotion to Viceroy of Portuguese India in 1524. Top job. He sailed back one last time, probably picturing a long reign overseeing the colonial enterprise. Instead, he got to Cochin, unpacked his bags, and promptly died. After all that sailing, all that fighting, all that rather forceful negotiation, he barely got to redecorate the office. So, hero or villain? Back in Portugal, resting easy in this grand monastery, he's the guy who launched a global empire and made the country fabulously rich. To many on the receiving end of his cannons in India and the Arab world, he was the sharp end of a brutal stick. I suppose your answer depends entirely on which end of the cannon you happen to be standing. What's undeniable, standing here in the quiet chill of the monastery, is that his voyages reshaped the world and started a messy, complicated new era. And having pondered that uncomfortable legacy beside his tomb, amidst all this Manueline splendor, it felt like a good time to leave Vasco to his eternal rest, or eternal unease, whichever applies. Lisbon's Lament, Fado's Fateful Flow. Having just left Vasco da Gama mouldering away in his fancy monastery tomb, surrounded by enough carved stone to build a small town, I needed something less sepulchral. I needed a distraction. I needed lunch. So I was following my nose, which is generally a reliable compass in Lisbon, down a steep alley that couldn't decide if it was a street or a staircase. It smelled promisingly of grilled sardines. Then I heard it, not the sizzle of fish, but a sound like someone was peeling grief right off their bones, raw and ragged. A woman's voice, unplugged, unadorned, echoing between the plaster walls outside a little tavern door. This wasn't busking for spare change. This wasn't background music. This felt intensely private, like stumbling onto a shouted prayer or a tearful argument you weren't supposed to overhear. I had no clue what the words meant, my Portuguese being rudimentary at best, but the feeling hit me square in the chest. It was the sound of profound, world-weary sadness, delivered with astonishing power. That, apparently, was Fado. Turns out, Fado is Portugal's signature sound, born sometime in the early 1800s, though nobody seems entirely sure where. Like any good origin story involving heartbreak, the details are fuzzy. Maybe it started with sailors in the dockside dives of Alfama, or maybe it drifted in with Moorish melodies or African rhythms, or maybe it hitched a ride back from Brazil. Portugal seemed to specialize in exporting people and importing melancholy, so its music having complicated parentage makes sense. The name itself comes from the Latin fatum, fate, which tells you pretty much all you need to know about the Portuguese outlook. Expect the worst, but make it sound beautiful. The emotional core of fado is something called saudade. It's one of those words translators Panko gives away, a deep nostalgic ache for something gone, a lover maybe, or a lost empire. Portugal had one of those, or just the nagging sense that things aren't quite right and probably won't be. If the American blues is about losing your job or your woman, fado sounds like it's lamenting the inherent tragedy of the human condition, possibly while wearing a dramatic shawl. There are supposedly two main flavors. Lisbon fado is the gritty, street-level stuff I'd stumbled upon. Then there's Coimbra fado, sung mostly by university men in black capes, apparently trying to look stoic while contemplating existential dread, or possibly just the price of textbooks. Both kinds absolutely require a guitarra portuguesa, a 12-stringed instrument shaped uncanny like a teardrop. It looks like a teardrop that learned to sing. How fitting. And you need a singer who sounds like they've seen it all, preferably twice, and weren't impressed either time. Naturally, Fado got dragged into politics. Under the Salazar dictatorship, the Estado Novo regime decided this music of sadness was the perfect soundtrack for national identity. Keep people misty-eyed about the past, maybe they won't notice the present. It got cleaned up, broadcast on state radio, and turned into a sort of officially sanctioned gloom. Some singers, like the legendary Amalia Rodriguez, took it global, making sorrow sound impossibly elegant. But after the 1974 revolution, Fado got briefly sidelined, tainted by its association with the old regime. It just retreated back to the alleys and waited, because Fado isn't famous because it's trendy, it seems to be famous because in certain Lisbon neighborhoods it's just there, like cobblestones or the smell of the sea. It's sung by people who probably fix plumbing or file paperwork by day, but carry lifetimes of emotion inside them after dark. They've stuck a UNESCO label on it now, studied it in universities, recorded slick versions. But the real thing, the raw stuff, still feels like it belongs to the cracks in the pavement, fueled by cheap red wine and shared sorrow. Back in my alley, the woman finished her song. Silence hung in the air, thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken feelings. No applause, no bow. She just took a long drag, looking less like a performer and more like someone who'd just wrestled a sadness demon to the ground. Maybe she had. The whole experience felt strangely fitting for this trip, another layer of intense history and emotion encountered almost by accident, much like navigating the confusing car rental situation back on São Miguel. I fumbled for a coin and dropped it into her open guitar case. Not because she asked, visually or otherwise. It just felt like the right response. Fado, I decided, doesn't really want your spare change. It demands some kind of emotional payment, a small toll for witnessing something so brutally honest, a kind of penance. Pizza pilgrimage, pastries passed, ruins reached. Lisbon, having previously serenaded me with its soundtrack of beautiful doom sung into back alleys, seemed determined to offer lighter distractions. After mentally wrestling with the complicated business dealings of fellows like Vasco da Gama, men who treated international trade less like a negotiation and more like a hostage situation with spices, the natural next step seemed obvious. Find something less historically fraught, possibly involving sugar, or so my travel companion insisted. The item in question was pastéis de nata, Lisbon's legendary egg custard tarts. They were spoken of with a hushed reverence typically associated with discovering your car wasn't actually towed. I, however, took a pass. It's nothing against Portugal, but the concept of warm, sweet, eggy goo in a cup made of pastry, well, let's just say my enthusiasm remained firmly custard-docked. Some culinary experiences are best left to those with sturdier convictions, or perhaps just different taste buds. Having successfully dodged the nation's pride in baked goods form, we sought out the equally famous Pink Street. It delivered precisely what the name promised. It was pink, aggressively pink, like a vat of Pepto-Bismol had tragically lost containment and flooded a city block. Bars and eateries crammed the sidewalks, their patios buzzing mostly with tourists striking poses against the aggressively cheerful asphalt, presumably documenting their deep connection with Portuguese pavement culture. We bypassed the selfie brigades and settled for pizza, because when in Lisbon, do as the slightly confused tourists do and eat mediocre Italian food on a street painted the color of embarrassment. Perhaps it was the refined carbohydrates. Perhaps the sheer visual assault of the pink pavement had short-circuited our common sense. But we next agreed that a small hike sounded like a capital idea. You know the type. It starts as a pleasant stroll in theory and rapidly escalates into a sweaty, oxygen-deprived shuffle uphill, where every step fuels a deep sense of betrayal by your own legs. This particular death march, however, had an upside. Cresting a hill, gasping like landed fish, we found ourselves blinking up at the spectacular ruin of the Carmo Convent. Now, this wasn't just some picturesque pile of old rocks. This was the skeletal remains of a colossal Gothic church, slapped together between 1389 and 1423 by some ambitious soul named Nuno Álvares Pereira. It stood there, minding its own ecclesiastical business, until November 1st, 1755. That's when a rather significant earthquake, chased by a tsunami and a city-wide fire sale, decided Lisbon needed a radical makeover. The church roof, apparently disagreeing with the tectonic shifts, collapsed inwards, leaving nothing between the soaring stone arches and the sky. After the day-glow artificiality of Pink Street, the raw, fractured honesty of the convent felt like finding a diamond in a landfill. Inside my head, a small voice whispered, "Okay, this is more like it. Less pepto, more pathos." Rather than trying to glue it all back together, which seems sensible, the powers that be turned the magnificent wreckage into the Carmo Archaeological Museum back in 1864. It became both a memorial to the disaster and a storage unit for Portugal's historical odds and ends. Wandering through the roofless nave feels strangely peaceful. You pass the surprisingly preserved Gothic tomb of King Ferdinand I, looking rather composed for a medieval monarch whose ceiling fell in. Nearby, a Roman sarcophagus from the 3rd or 4th century, crawling with carved muses, seems to ponder its long journey from antiquity to earthquake exhibit. And then, just to keep things interesting, there are a couple of pre-Columbian mummies tucked away, looking exceptionally lost, and probably wondering if their travel insurance covered acts of God and Portuguese archaeologists. Some people might just see a broken building, impressive architecture tragically interrupted. But standing there, under that open sky framed by jagged stone, where disaster struck and history was quite deliberately left exposed, well, let's just say it feels a bit like standing inside a scar. Convent colours, chronicling centuries of ceramic craft. Having contemplated the impressive wreckage of Carmo Convent, a stark reminder of Lisbon's catastrophic 1755 earthquake, what's the logical next step for the curious traveller? Why, to find a picture of the city before it all went sideways naturally. This quest led us, via the modern convenience of an Uber, to the National Tile Museum. Apparently, Portugal's history is best understood through glazed ceramics. The museum, officially the Museu Nacional do Azulejo, is ground zero for understanding Portugal's obsession with decorative tiles, known locally as azulejos. Think of them as the nation's official skin. They're on churches, train stations, houses, probably on the undersides of bridges for all I know. This particular temple to tile resides in the former convent of Madre de Deus, a sprawling structure founded back when 1509 was considered recent news. It tells the story of azulejos from their Moorish-influenced geometric beginnings in the 15th century right up to whatever people are doing with tiles these days. Here lies a delightful paradox, a museum dedicated to preserving fragile, beautiful artwork, itself housed in a building that seemed to be, shall we say, embracing its own history with gusto. The place felt authentically old, complete with the kind of atmospheric dampness that suggested the roof might be more historically accurate than structurally sound. One might even say the occasional drip added an unintended water feature to certain exhibits. It certainly lent character. Inside, past walls covered in centuries of blue and white squares depicting everything from saints to sea monsters, the collection marches chronologically. You see the evolution from simple patterns to complex narratives. The highlight, especially after our visit to Carmo, was an enormous tile panorama of Lisbon. It shows the city sprawling and confident, blissfully unaware of the seismic tantrum awaiting it in 1755. Seeing this vast, detailed map, rendered meticulously piece by tiny piece, brought the scale of that disaster into sharp focus. Was viewing this ceramic ghost of Lisbon past worth dodging potential ceiling moisture? Without a doubt. It's one thing to stand among the ruins. It's another entirely to see the before snapshot, captured forever in glazed clay. Lost legends, lingering lore lives. In the slightly leaky confines of the National Tile Museum, where history dripped almost as much as the ceiling, you couldn't help but reflect on Portugal's national obsession. The azulejo. These aren't just tiles, they're the country's ceramic skin, plastered onto everything from grand palaces to humble bathrooms. It turns out the word comes from the Arabic for polished stone. Not, as everyone assumes, the Portuguese word for blue, which is quite the footnote considering the tidal wave of blue and white that eventually washed over the nation. The whole thing started, as many things did around here, with the Moors and their intricate geometric patterns, nice stuff, but apparently not quite Portuguese enough. Enter King Manuel I, who, after a trip to Seville in the late 15th century, seemingly developed a severe case of tile envy. He saw Spain's fancy decorated walls and basically said, "Hold my port wine." He brought the idea back, and Portuguese artisans got to work, initially sticking fairly close to the Moorish script. Then Vasco da Gama sailed off and brought back tales and eventually goods from the East, including a look at sophisticated Chinese porcelain. Suddenly, simple geometry wasn't cutting it. Portugal needed blue, acres of blue, and white. This new style swept the country faster than you can say cultural appropriation, covering churches, monasteries, and any wall that stood still long enough. My neck started to ache just thinking about the poor souls who had to paint biblical epics onto thousands of tiny squares. Essentially proofing walls against boredom, one saintly portrait at a time. These weren't just decorations, they were the nation's storybooks, a kind of ceramic catechism for the masses, depicting everything from saints rolling their eyes heavenward to epic battles and shipwrecks. These glazed squares proved remarkably durable. When the ground opened up and swallowed half of Lisbon in the 1755 earthquake, a surprising number of azulejo panels clung stubbornly to the remaining walls. They soldiered on through revolutions and even Salazar's dictatorship, where they were conveniently repurposed as symbols of unwavering national identity, history etched in enamel for all to see. Today, they're still everywhere. From dazzling train station murals that look like medieval hallucinations to the slightly faded saints presiding over crumbling alleyways. Seeing those ancient tiles, survivors of earthquakes and emperors housed in a building that seemed one decent downpour away from joining them in ruin, wasn't exactly discouraging. It seems in Portugal, even the museums understand that permanence is relative, especially when expressed in glazed clay. Fiery Fall, Lisbon's reconstruction and reflection. Looking at an enormous tile panorama in a slightly damp museum, the one showing Lisbon serene and whole before everything went sideways, you had to ask, what happens when a city known as the jewel of an empire just sort of stops being there? 1 minute it's All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1755, churches packed tighter than sardines in a holy tin, candles blazing away. The next minute, around 9:40 a.m., the ground decides to do a violent shimmy. It wasn't just a little tremor. We're talking a magnitude 8.5 to 9.0 monster earthquake lasting up to 6 minutes, which feels like a geological age when buildings are collapsing around your ears. Grand palaces, including the king's own royal Ribeira, churches galore, ordinary homes, they all pancaked. People ran screaming towards the open space of the docks, which turned out to be exactly the wrong move. A series of tsunamis decided to join the party, marching up the Tagus River and washing crowds out to sea. As if that wasn't enough, knocked-over candles and kitchen fires ignited the ruins, and the city burned for a solid week. Tens of thousands died. The exact number is still debated, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 souls, maybe more. Amidst the chaos, it raised awkward questions. Why, people muttered, did God flatten the churches on his big day but leave the city's less reputable establishments standing? Food for thought that the king, Joseph I, survived mostly because he'd developed a healthy fear of ceilings and preferred living in tents, which suddenly seemed less eccentric and more like genius-level forward planning. But the man who really grabbed the reins was his prime minister, a fellow known to history as the Marquis of Pombal. His immediate reaction was supposedly blunt: bury the dead and feed the living. No nonsense there. Pombal then attacked the problem of a completely demolished capital like a general planning an invasion. He rolled out the first modern grid plan in Europe for the downtown area, now called the Baixa Pombalina. Wide streets, uniform buildings, all very rational. He even cooked up early anti-seismic building codes, testing models by having troops march around them to simulate tremors, which sounds suspiciously like an excuse to get soldiers to do jumping jacks. While busy with blueprints and rubble clearing, he also found time to sideline the Jesuits and generally reshape the government to be more efficient, or at least more under his control. This wasn't just a local Portuguese disaster. It sent shockwaves through Europe's thinking. Voltaire took a swing at the "everything happens for the best" philosophy in Candide. Others debated whether it was divine wrath or just nature doing its occasionally terrifying thing. Out of the dust and debate, modern seismology got its start, with people beginning to study earthquakes as actual geology instead of heavenly fury. You can still see Pombal's handiwork today, walking the orderly grid of the Baixa. There's even a museum where you can experience a simulated quake, presumably without the week-long firestorm add-on, and a grand monument shows the Marquis himself surveying the city he rebuilt, a testament to Enlightenment planning and maybe a touch of autocratic impatience. Standing there, contemplating the sheer scale of destruction and rebirth etched into the city's stones, the weight of history felt immense. One of us, drained by the day's wandering through ruins, art, and the ghosts of catastrophes, voiced the most practical thought we'd had all afternoon. Let's just eat here. Honestly, it was the best plan anyone had come up with. And so, from Belém's grandeur to Carmo's sobering ruins, even if we did swap iconic pastries for Pink Street pizza, Lisbon laid bare its dramatic history. It's a city bearing its formidable past openly. Next, we'll explore how that past reverberated and perhaps reshaped realities across distant lands.